Electronic security and life safety pros, and welcome to day 2 of the 2020 ESA District Week. This is a nationwide industry advocacy movement produced by ESA. Today's town hall will focus on the impact of codes and standards on the intrusion, fire, and life safety markets. It's our second in a series of 3 virtual town halls, and I hope you're finding value in the legislative content we're sharing throughout the week. This and all town halls will be available on demand at esaweb.org/districtweek2020, so you can rewatch the video and share it with your colleagues. All of you are muted for the duration of this town hall, but that doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. Click on the Q&A icon to pose a question, and we'll forward those on to our experts. I'd like to introduce our codes and standards experts in just a moment, but before I do, I'd like to recognize the sponsor of this session. This company has been an ESA strategic partner for quite some time now. They are a global leader in power and data transmission solutions for pro security, surveillance, access control, and fire, Altronics. Thank you, Altronics. With that said, let's dive in. First, I'll introduce you to our speakers. Rodger Reiswig is the chairman of ESA's Codes and Standards Committee and the vice president of industry relations at Johnson Controls. He's joined today by Clary, vice president of Codes and Standards Compliance at ESA member company Bay Alarm. Driving our conversation is Chris Heaton, vice president of advocacy and public affairs for ESA. Rodger, let's dig in on the state of the industry and recent developments as it relates to codes and standards.
Thank you, and I appreciate that, and thank you for allowing me to present today along with Clary, my vice chair of the committee. I've been fortunate to be part of ESA and the Codes and Standards Committee for several years now, and then for the past 2 years I've been the chair. And during that time, we've done a lot of work getting more involved with ESA and the codes process. So as we were talking about what would be good to present to the membership today, we started to think about, does everybody really understand the process, and why is it important for ESA to get involved and the impact that we're able to have? So what we thought we would do today is go through kind of an understanding of how things are done, kind of a look behind the curtains, if you will. And my colleague, Dr. Clary, has also been involved in the industry for many, many years, as well as I. So we thought between the 3 of us, we could do that today. So as we start out, one of the questions that Shane and I, as we talk, get asked a lot is, what's a code, what's a standard, what's a listing standard? And we see them used interchangeably. We talk about building codes, we have installation standards, and then we have listing standards. And we'll go through a little bit more of these, but in general, building codes typically tell us when to do something. An installation standard then tells us how to do that. And then the listing standard applies to the products and or services on how they need to be accomplished or what requirements they need to adhere to. So one kind of drives the other, and it's important to see in the life cycle or the life safety cycle how one impacts the other. And Shane, feel free if you want to jump in at any time and add to
Yeah,
it.
and thank you, Roger. And the building codes would also include uh, the locally adopted fire code, the mechanical code, existing building codes, or stuff like that. So it's just not strictly the building code; it's the full suite of codes that a particular jurisdiction that you're working in may be using.
Very good. So there's two major code writing entities or standard development organizations, SDOs, that we use. And some people forget that they're used more and more places than just the United States. We see these as Shane and I travel the globe. We see NFPA and the International Code Council used all around the world, in the Mideast, Latin America, Central America, um, in many, many different countries. And they are, as I travel around outside the US, there's a little bit of confusion. NFPA and the I codes, or the ICC, are two separate entities. One is not under the umbrella of the other. They are in some ways competing organizations for codes and standards. And the I codes do adopt or reference a lot of the NFPA standards that are out there. But these are the two biggies that we see around the globe. And predominantly, this is what's used in the United States. So, question that I'm still asked from time to time is, for example, in NFPA 72, the National Fire Alarm and Signaling Code, where does it tell me in 72 that I need a fire alarm system in my building? And the answer is it doesn't. It says where required by other building codes or laws, this is how you install the system that they're telling you to do. So for the building codes, we start out and we look at the NFPA, typically NFPA 101, the Life Safety Code, and or the International Code Council, or IBC, International Building Code, and they'll give us the when something needs to happen. And then along with that, people will ask us, okay, well, in those building codes, when do I need a fire alarm system? And as we say many times in our life safety world, it depends. It depends on the occupancy type, how the building is going to be used, and the load, how many people will be in that building, and what kind of maybe chemicals or processes will be taking place in that building. So what happens is, in our code world, you need to understand what your group type is or occupancy type is.
And Roger, on that, I'll have occasionally we'll have at Bay Alarm Company have a salesperson come to me with a set of plans, and they'll give it to me, and I need the parts list for a NFPA 72 fire alarm system at this location. So I'll open up the plans, look at them for maybe 30 seconds, roll them back up and hand them to them. It's done. And they'll look at me with kind of a puzzle, and I'll say, 72 doesn't require anything. It is what the building code or fire code requires. And then on that, you do need to, in addition to looking at the model codes, you need to take a look at what the state may have adopted. And in addition to that, especially now with the internet, is take a look at what the local jurisdiction may have adopted. And the best way for that is to go, in most jurisdictions, go to the city clerk's portal and then look up the municipal code for that city or town, and then from there drill down to the locally adopted fire code. And that may tell you some amendments that jurisdiction may require for a fire alarm system.
That's a great point, Shane, and thank you for that. Absolutely. So when we talk about occupancy groups, and Shane, again, feel free to jump in here. When we talk about occupancy groups, it's because not all buildings have the same life safety requirements. If I'm in a business occupancy or an office building, it's going to have entirely different requirements than if I'm in some kind of an industrial facility. So we need to understand what they are, what our occupancy groups are, and they define what needs to happen. And just as an example, I pulled out the main occupancy groups that we typically will look at or have our buildings applied to. And we're looking at like assembly occupancies. That's where I have people maybe at a movie theater or a place of worship or something of the like. And then business occupancy, kind of self-explanatory, except a business occupancy will also entail colleges and universities. A lot of people will think or misapply and think that educational is for my college or universities, but really it's a business occupancy. And if you've ever had, I just had 2 daughters graduate from college, university, and believe me, it's a business, right? So, and they treat it like a business, and that's how we need to look at that. So educational then is for the K through 12, kindergarten through 12th grade, or primary education as we call it. And whether it's public or private, there's the same requirements are in there. And you have other caveats as we go through all of these on occupant load, how many feet above grade or entry level, or how far a fire department's ladder can reach, and so forth. We have factories, hazards, institutional, mercantile, like a mall area, and residential. So pretty much any assembly or any occupancy you could think of is going to be covered under the I codes and NFPA 101.
And this is Shane. On that, if it's a brand new project, hopefully you'll have a set of the architectural plans from the architect. And on page 1, the architect should have declared what the occupancy type is for the particular project. Now, if you're doing a older building that may have been built a number of years ago, then you as the designer may have to make the determination as to what the occupancy classification is for that building.
Yeah, that's a great point, Shane, because I'll have people come to me today, as probably you do, where it's a new business or a new building that's being constructed. And they'll come to us, and sometimes we'll do what we call design build, where they'll award us, or they'll want us to award the project, where they want us to figure out, okay, what needs to go into the building, and then you tell me what the parts and pieces are going to cost, and then how much to install all of that. And sometimes on a new construction, they will ask me, well, what occupancy group do you think this building is going to be under? And that's not for me or for Shane or for any of us as installer maintainers to figure out. It's got to be from, as Shane indicated, from the architect or maybe the general contractor. What did they get the building permitted as? Because I can design it as a business occupancy, but in reality, if they designated this from the municipality area as an assembly occupancy, it doesn't matter what I called it, it's what they call it. So before you go down that road, particularly in a new facility, and think that it's one occupancy, ask the question. And there have been several cases where a sales rep or a designer was going along designing it to a certain occupancy type, all later to find out that that's not what it was classified as. It was classified as something else.
Rodger, this is Chris. How do the occupancy classifications there correlate to how buildings are zoned at the local level? The Planning and Zoning Commission provides for commercial, residential R2, R1. They have their different classifications. Are they correlated for these types of occupancy groups?
They are. As you go across, whether you're doing regular construction work, plumbing work, site excavation work, whatever it is, these same types of occupancy groups, their definitions, their usage types are basically common throughout all facets of the construction market.
Well, I believe, Chris, you're talking about how a certain area is zoned, right?
Right. The city council zones an intersection as a commercial 1, 2, or 3 type property, and each one of those have different occupancy requirements.
Yeah, but that's the zoning laws, which is not generally the same that's found within the building code. That will at least tell you that it's zoned for commercial, but then it's up to, again, as we've been saying, from the architect for the building that's going to be built there, as to what occupancy group the particular building is going to be in.
Right, but they can't conflict with one another. In other words, you can't build a residential apartment complex for something that's zoned as a commercial. Correct.
Correct. But within the commercial realm, you could have a B, business. You could have an A, assembly, a theater.
Mm-hmm.
You could have M's, mercantile.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a full range of occupancy groups that are within a quote unquote commercial zone.
Yeah, great point. Thanks.
Yeah, no, good. Thanks, Shane. So moving on, in the simplest terms, we talk about how codes will direct or drive the standards. Once a code is implemented or adopted, and that's a good point too, and Shane kind of alluded to it earlier. Just because a certain edition or a newer edition of a document has been published by the ICODE and or NFPA does not necessarily mean that your jurisdiction is under that. As we go around the United States, at least, we'll see different states adopting different editions throughout the year. It just depends on when they want to adopt those. So, people will call me and say, hey, the latest, the 2018 edition of the ICODE just came out, and what do I have to do in my building or in this area? And I have to ask them, well, what have they adopted formally? And because that will be a key driver. So that's another question. Well, people will contact us and say, hey, in the ICODE for this type of occupancy, what do I need or what's required for life safety systems? And usually my first question back is, what edition are you under? Because it does change from cycle to cycle or from edition to edition. And typically cycles, we talk about cycles, is once every 3 years.
And in some states, it may not be statewide, such as Arizona does not have a statewide adoption of a building code or a fire code. It's by city or district. So you could be on one edition of the I code or NFPA 72 on one side of the street, and if the other side of the street is in a different town, you could be completely on a different set of codes.
Yeah, very, very good. And so, like, if you're in the 2018 edition of the International Building Code, and that's what's been adopted in your jurisdiction, within that code, that edition, it will reference the standards. And this is how we get to, well, which edition of NFPA 72 or 13 or 10 do I have to follow? That's all spelled out when they adopted that document, within that document. Now, some states or jurisdictions will change those standards that they adopt, but typically they follow with what's in the 101 of the ICODE. So if you're in the 2018 edition of the International Building Code, that would put you to the 2016 edition of NFPA 72. So you'll find that the standards are always going to be a couple of years or lagging behind whatever building code's been out. Because if you think about it, when you're at the committee level and you're putting together the 2021 edition of the International Building Code, well, I can't reference the 2022 edition of 72 because it's not out yet. The public haven't had a chance to review that. So I have to reference what's available at that time. So many people will ask that question too. Well, how come that those are off? But that's how those all fall together. So once I know the edition and what building code you're under, then that helps for all of us to understand the standards and everything else and how it all lines up in place. So some examples of standards, we've been talking about this here for a few minutes now. So one of the biggest ones in our life safety world is the National Fire Alarm and Signaling Code, or NFPA 72. NFPA 13 is a standard for installation of sprinkler systems, or NFPA 10, standard for portable fire extinguishers, or 92, if you do smoke control, it's the standard. And again, all of these tell you how to do their respective disciplines, but they don't tell you when to do them. It's always going to be back to the building code. When a building code requires extinguishers, requires smoke control, etc. These are the documents then that you will adhere to.
And just to avoid some confusion, even though the title of NFPA 72 is the National Fire Alarm and Signaling Code, it is in reality a standard. 72 by itself is not a code.
Yeah. That's a great point. There's a lot of neat history when you go back into 72 and the genesis of it and why it's still called code. And maybe that's a topic for another day, Chris, because I think some of the history is kind of fascinating as we go through this. So then we get to to products, right? So, so I work for a company. We manufacture products as well as install, test, and maintain them. So we deal a lot with getting products what we call listed or certified. So a listing standard is where, and we have those in a lot of different facets of our world today, whether it's a microwave, a toaster, shingles for your roof, fire alarm systems. All of these have testing standards that they need to go by to ensure that a product is going to meet some performance criteria that's been set. So a listing standard that's been created then can be, or it's what we test to. So for example, a fire alarm control unit is listed to UL 864. Now, Underwriters Laboratory houses a not-for-profit organization under Underwriters Laboratory that takes care of all the standards for the United States for the listing of products. But they're not the only entity that can test to those listings. So although they're the repository for our standards, whether it's for pool stations, motion detectors, or what have you, they're not the only place that you can get products tested. So what the building codes and the standards will say is products need to meet the standards and be certified or tested by a nationally recognized testing laboratory, or what we affectionately call a NERDL. Now, what this means is the code does not say it must be UL listed, because that would drive you to that one for-profit entity then that would test that product. So there are several that are out there that we're able as manufacturers to go and have our products tested to. All are tested to that same UL standard. So, so that's what we call a NERDL. Now, in the United States, the nationally recognized testing laboratories, those are, because the question might be is, well, who's in charge of those? Well, who recognizes those? That comes from OSHA, Occupational Safety Health Administration. They're the ones that deem that. And if you go to OSHA's website, you'll actually find, I think it's about 18 NERDLs that are actually met their criteria for testing life safety systems. So then these requirements are often, they're based on the UL's published recognized standards, but they're not the only game in town. You know, as you go, for example, and you buy a new toaster today, it's very, very common for the toaster not to have a UL listing, but to have maybe an ETL listing or some other entity that's out there. And as a manufacturer, there are some products that I make that does not have a UL mark on it. Instead, I'll have them listed or certified by other entities, albeit though to the same exact standards. So an examples of these standards, we have the UL 864, one of the biggest ones in the fire alarm world, the standard for control units and accessories, being enunciators, power supplies, the control units themselves. Embedded in UL 864 is also smoke control. Maybe you've heard the term UUKL for smoke control. That's embedded in UL 864. UL 1971s are standard for signaling devices for the hearing impaired or deaf community, the strobes that we use for fire alarm use. UL 217 for smoke alarms, 827 for central station alarm services. So the UL standards too, I think it's a point to know that a listing standard is not just for a product. It can also be for a service. When I do central station service really, yes, I have product that needs to meet certain requirements, but a lot of it talks about my response times, how I communicate back to the owner and other entities. So a lot of processes are also UL certified or listing standards. So these are our listing standards for products. And again, listing standards aren't just about products. Sometimes they're about services. And I don't know, Shane, if you have anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, the one thing, and thank you, Roger, is that listed also versus label. Like a product could be listed to UL 864 or 217 by ETL, Edison Testing Laboratory. But if you're installing a central station service system to be certificated by UL, and UL themselves has not listed that or labeled that product, UL would not accept that product because they'll see that, yes, while it's been labeled or listed to our standard, we did not do it ourselves, therefore we will not accept it. And I do know occasionally installing companies get kind of caught in that. So make sure that depending on if you are going to be certifying a system either by FM, ETL, or UL, that your products have their particular label on the product.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic point, Shane. And these companies compete for businesses of manufacturers and service providers to be able to use them to get our products and or services either marked, labeled, or listed or certified.
Does that, and to follow up on that, does that drive some products manufacturers to seek listings from multiple NERDLs for that reason, like you mentioned, Shane, because UL won't recognize an ETL, that they have to get it dual recognition?
Correct. You'll see a lot of products that are both UL and FM. And occasionally UL, FM, and ETL. But again, depending on who, especially if, and this is primarily for those systems, fire alarm systems that are to be certified for central station service, that if it's going to be, if the document is going to be issued by UL, make sure that all your products have been labeled by UL. And if you're doing one that's for FM, factory mutual, make sure that the products you're using have the FM diamond on it.
A good question there, Chris. Absolutely. Then we talk about how these documents are developed. We talk about the codes and how what they drive, and the standards and what they drive, and then the listing products or services and how they're driven. But kind of how does all of this come together, or what really occurs? Well, if we look at the International Code Council first, these are all the various documents that they have. What's nice about the ICC process is all of the documents fall together under the same, what we call cycle or change or addition, update, however you want to refer to that. So when they went from 2015 to 2018, all of these documents were updated together. What's nice about that is they all kind of depend on one another, and they have pointers to one another, and some of the languages that are used are the same. They don't have to worry about correlation issues, about one being in 2016, one 2017. By updating all of them together, it helps to harmonize their documents. So that's kind of what one nice aspect about the ICC process. Now, within the ICC, each code is comprehensive. I mean, it's made to be standalone, but they also are made to be used with one another. So, and that all depends upon the state, municipality, or country that chooses to adopt, because some don't adopt all of the documents. Some just adopt what they want or what they need. And, but they're all developed according to the same process and in the same forum. Actually, it'll take maybe up to two weeks or so time frame as these documents go through, looking at all the proposals and all the comments during a time. And the reference consensus standards that are developed by the standard development organizations, SDOs, are what we're referring to. And I took this off the iCodes website. The iCodes are the most widely used and adopted set of building codes, building safety codes in the world. And I, as a person, again, who runs around the globe a lot, until the past few months, you absolutely see the iCodes in action in many, many parts around the globe. Now, NFPA and ICC, they make up of various interest categories, right? So this isn't just the manufacturers or just the installers or just the fire marshals. You really see a various trades come around the table to work on these. And yes, there are code officials that are involved, but you also have design professionals, engineers, fire protection engineers. You have consultants that are out there. You have various trade associations like ESA. building contractors, the people that actually are installing this stuff, manufacturers that create the products, various government agencies, doesn't just have to be code officials, but it might be GSA or it might be military, other entities. But anybody that has an interest can participate. If you are not one of these categories, or you're retired, or you're still in school, but you think that there's a better way that something should be done and you have some substantiation to help with that, by all means, you are more than welcome to submit those, and they are looked at just like any other proposals or comments are looked at. Now, the trade associations, if I back up a second, you say, well, why is it a trade association involved as opposed to just maybe the manufacturer or just a single person going to the table? Well, if we go, or when we go to the table and represent, for example, ESA, it's viewed as we are speaking for the industry or the membership of ESA. And although everybody has the same opportunity to participate, some trade associations, you're looked at a little bit more high regard, because you are truly looking to bring the interest of a large group of people rather than just yourself or your company's perspective. So anybody can participate. It's open, transparent process. Again, whether you're an NFPA or you're in the ICOs, the interest is balanced. And when we say it's a balanced interest, it means that the committee, if it's made up of, let's just say 30 people, well, you can't have 10 people that are all manufacturers and dominate part of the committee or how it operates. So you have to have a balanced approach. I have to have so many manufacturers, enforcers, AHJs, authorities having jurisdictions, engineers, special experts, and so forth. Because you want to try and get a consensus of all of the people around the table from the various aspects. So it's not just a one type of interest category being represented. And there's due processes in both of the entities, whether it's NFPA or the ICOs, about how proposals are submitted, comments are submitted. You have a chance for an appeal to go to the floor, get membership to maybe help sway the document in one way or the other. You can appeal to a board to ask them, about, hey, I think this needs to go in a different direction, and I tried following the process, but the outcome wasn't what I thought it was. So again, anybody can participate in this. You don't have to be a fire marshal or anyone like that. Anyone is able to provide input.
Yeah, this is Shane. And we would encourage, especially members of the ESA, and I think we have some slides coming up on this, to get involved with the process. There are similarities between both the I-codes and NFPA, but there also are some significant differences. For the NFPA, they meet and begin the process with technical committees. So it's a little more specialized, depending on what particular standard or document that the comments or proposals are being submitted by or to. Is there, you have the committee up on the stage, and then you have anyone in the audience can then come up and speak. For the NFPA process, especially at the committee level, you're allowed to maybe develop your thoughts a little better, because you're not on a clock. Whereas with the I codes, you have 2 minutes, and you only have one shot. They can come up on a rebuttal, but there's just a little more structure to it. When you get to the final meetings of the NFPA, which is what they call their tech session, there's a little more structured. But again, you have a little more time to develop your hypothesis than you do with the I codes. But in the end, it pretty much gives the voting members a good picture of what the issues are, so that they can make their cast their ballots.
Yeah, very good. So the ICC process, it's an open process, and there are safeguards to avoid domination by a proprietary interest or a certain type of a group of people wanting to override something. But at the end of the day, the ICC is a governmental consensus process, and the final vote rests with those that administer, formulate, or enforcing the regulations relating to public health, safety, and welfare. So although during the first rounds, if you hear the first public hearings that occur, any member can vote. Once it gets to the final balloting and voting, that kind of rests with the government officials. So we call that a ICC governmental consensus process, or that's actually what ICC calls it. Now, the codes are very similar in their development, and each code is comprehensive, whether you're in the NFPA world or the iCode world, and they're coordinated and compatible with one another across the platforms, but not coordinated across NFPA and the ICC, meaning because they are separate entities, and in some ways they compete against one another with how they want their codes and standards to be utilized. So NFPA does a lot of work to make sure that NFPA's codes and standards and guides are compatible with one another, just as the ICC does, but there is not typically a lot of work done. There is some work with us that are outsiders between NFPA and ICC to try to correlate them as best we can or reference one another. But as NFPA and ICC, there are two different entities, and they don't typically try to coordinate amongst themselves. Both are developed to a very similar process, though. We have public input, public comment. You have a chance for go into a membership and voice your concerns or why you believe something should be changed. And then you also have a chance to go to an appeal to a higher level within NFPA or ICC to be heard. And both are reference consensus standards developed by SDO or standard developing organizations. So in NFPA, the development process, this is off of NFPA's website, is pretty straightforward, right? You start out at the public input stage, and this is where we as ESA, Shane and I have done a lot of work with some various documents and bringing it to the ESA Fire Life Safety Standards Committee, and talking about this document is what we call in cycle. In cycle means it's open for changes to be submitted. And we sit down as a group and we say, okay, what would be a change that we would want to do to this section or this chapter of this document, and send it in on behalf of ESA. And typically that would go under Chris's name. And when we do that, that's something that we as a committee, and maybe we don't all agree on that, but the consensus of the committee at ESA is we would like this to be changed or something done differently within a document, a code, or a standard. So we can submit that. If you don't want to participate in that, you can do it yourself. But again, it takes a little bit more time and energy on your own side to understand what's in cycle, how do I send it in? So we can kind of help with all of that. And then there's closing dates, and then all of these inputs are put together and they are made into what's called a first draft meeting. And that's where the committee comes together and then they review all of the inputs that have been submitted, whether it's from a person that just did it on their own, or from an association, trade association like ESA. They all get filtered into that same meeting. And then after that meeting, everybody decides on what they want to accept, not accept, or change or modify. That becomes what is called the first draft. And then that's balloted to the committee, and then that's posted. And then now you have a chance to comment on what the committee did. During the comment cycle, the same in the ICC world, you can't introduce what they call new material. So it has to be something that was already touched or started to be changed on at the first draft. So you can't come in later on and have some entirely new idea that you want to have done. Well, you're going to need to wait till the next cycle because that's viewed as new material. And then that second draft is balloted. The committee then gets a chance to ballot it, and then that's posted. Again, if you don't agree on that, but you've maintained involvement in the process, you have a chance to submit a notice of intent to make a motion, a NIPMAM. And then if that becomes certified, that becomes a CAM, certified amending motion. And then you have a chance to appeal to the membership at the NFPA annual meeting. Every year, including this year, NFPA has a technical session for all the documents that are in cycle and for anybody that wants to submit a nickname that becomes a CAM. And then based on that, if you still don't like what happened at the technical session, you have a chance for NFPA to go to the Standards Council, speak to them and say, look, I followed the process. I don't believe this is the right thing to do or this should have been changed. And then the Standards Council has a ruling whether to accept what you did or accept what the committee did and move on. That's kind of the NFPA process and their roadmap design. But at the end of the day, everybody gets to vote, not just the governmental entities. So as we kind of wrap up this part of it, NFPA is an industry consensus document. And ICC is a governmental consensus product. And again, these are from their websites, and this is what they say. So this isn't my interpretation or Shane's interpretation. ANSI accreditation, NFPA is ANSI accredited for how they go through their processes. IBC is not ANSI accredited. And there's different reasons why that's happened, but I think one of the biggest ones is because at the end of the day, only governmental figures are allowed to vote or to have final say on what goes into it. And that doesn't adhere to the ANSI accreditation process. So NFPA is accredited, but IBC is not. And both operate, typically all of the documents operate on a 3-year cycle. There are some exceptions in NFPA where some documents go to a 4-year or a 5-year cycle. And although it's not common, there are at times where some documents will request to the Standards Council to either slip a cycle or extend maybe a year or so for different things. As an example of that, there have been some documents that have committees who had submitted to the Standards Council to allow a 1-year hiatus or change or lengthening of their cycle due to what's happened in the US with the COVID-19 issue. And some have been granted that, while other documents have said, we're staying on our 3-year cycle and we're moving forward. So now let's go to listing standards. So this is where we sit down as another group of people and we decide on what qualifications a product or service needs to have. And within the UL world, Underwriters Laboratory, they are the repository for our listing standards in the United States. They call their committees Standards Technical Panels, or STPs. And you'll see it's very similar to what you saw within the NFPA and the ICODE world. Anybody can submit a proposal. If you think as part of a listing standard, something should be changed on how a product or service operates or functions, anybody can submit on that. Again, we at ESA, we try to do that as a committee and pool our resources together, and we'll submit them in under ESA's banner. And the committee has a chance to preliminary review what all has been submitted to them. They'll consider the comments. People will be able to write in, if they think this is a good idea, bad idea, what have you. And then that's balloted and the comment resolutions are out and it's circulated to make sure, everybody gets to see everybody else's vote. So it's not a secretive thing. Again, the same thing with NFPA. You get to see who voted for something or against something. And if they put comments in there, you get to read those comments. Because sometimes that might be something to maybe swayed you and say, gee, I didn't really think about it that way, or I didn't understand that fully. But after I read the comments from this person, it really helped me to understand that better, and maybe I changed my vote. So the comments are very, very important, I believe, in this process. And again, at ESA, when these are published, we will sit down as a committee and we review those, and then we'll decide, do we want to keep our ballot the same? Do we want to maybe add our own comments to it and rebuttal to what somebody else has said, and so forth?
And this is Shane. There is one major difference between the process that UL uses as opposed to what NFPA or the ICC uses, and it's the timing. Now, the UL does have to, every 5 years, have to go through a review of their document. But if something pops up because of technology or other events, and as an example is COVID-19, that UL can get the committee together again, or get the committee together and address issues that may have popped up or come up as opposed to having to, at that time, as opposed to having to wait for it to go on cycle. And recently, UL 827 has done this to address COVID-19 and the ability to operate operators at the home environment as opposed within the four walls of a supervising station. So they were not constricted to, well, we can't do anything for 2 more years because we're in cycle. They were able to pull the committee together and to come up with some language that still is going through the process as we speak, but quicker than having to wait another 2 years to address the issues that have popped up because of COVID-19. Whereas with the NFPA, we're sort of within the cycle. So even though we're in the middle of a pandemic, other than through a process called the TIA, we're sort of locked in to the cycles of getting any changes to made. And one thing I think on any of this, code making is like a ship at sea. It does not stop on a dime, or does not ability to turn on a dime. That it takes a long, sometimes up to 3 to 5 years to get a change in there, just because of the various processes that are in place.
Great. Thanks, Shane. So the STP, or Standards Technical Panel, the process at UL is open to anyone. Anyone can submit changes, preliminary review, comments only, no balloting goes around. You can view those, get an understanding of what's going on, look at the proposals and the comments that were submitted after the comments go out, recirculation out to all the members of the panel for their balloting, their voting, and then it's published. NFP or UL refers to these as editions. So you have like the same document, UL 864, the 5th edition, the 7th edition, or the 8th edition. That's what they're referring to, is when the document was changed. Now there can be minor revisions done to a document without having an edition changed. And in that case, you need to look at the year or when it was modified or revised as they look at it. So, so a full edition doesn't have to occur if there's just small minor things that are changed. And then it's up to the UL liaison to determine whether or not it's time to move it up to one full edition. So that's really kind of, there's not a hard and fast rule that after 50 comments or one major change when it goes to the next edition. So codes drive the standards, drive the listing standards. That's the kind of comprehensive life safety approach that we have today. So, you know, and again, there's people want to kind of pick and choose, or I just want to use one part of this, but they all flow together. You know, when we're doing life safety within a building and we're figuring out our occupancy code, our occupancy requirements, that's really the intent of the life safety then is driven from how the products are going to be installed. And how the products are going to be installed really depends upon how the products perform or how they're listed. And if you change any part of that on the type of products I'm going to utilize or the standards I'm going to install them to, you really end up possibly changing the entire intent of the life safety system. So it's important that how these one drives the other goes. It's not too much of an issue in the United States. Outside the United States, you start to see people want to pick and choose. I want to use the I codes or NFPA 101 to build the building or build the life safety system, but then I might want to use a different installation standard on how the fire alarm or life safety systems go in, and then I might want to use EN product or ISO product and not maybe UL product. And you're changing the whole life cycle or the life safety aspect of the system by doing that. So in the US, we're pretty much regimented where the code drives the standard, drives the listing. So with that, you know, kind of look at the philosophy of the life safety, you know, all kind of flows together. And hopefully after this, our time together, that maybe, you know, helps to cement in a little bit more about how our life safety systems and codes and standards work. As you see here, we have NFPA 101 or the IBC. They define our occupancies and how things are, what needs to be installed. And then they'll drive you Both documents drive you to the same standards on what to install, but then the standards tell you how to do that. And then those standards, whether it's a sprinkler head, an extinguisher, a smoke detector, they all rely on the UL listing standards of how that product needs to function. So all of these work hand in hand to make our products, our life safety systems in our industry. At ESA, we have a Standards and Fire Life Safety Committee. I've had the pleasure of chairing it for 2 years with Dr. Clary as my vice chair. And we've worked hard to get you, ESA, representatives on these various documents. And right now we have 18 people that are either principals or alternates. And almost every document, you're able to have somebody that is a principal, meaning they're the ones that have the voting right. And then you have an alternate. If the principal can't make it, the alternate can vote or speak on behalf if the principal's not there. So we can have 2 slots, if you will, for people around the table, or virtual table as times are today. But again, only 1 vote per principal. So we worked hard with NFPA 5000, the building code for NFPA, as well as NFPA 101, NFPA 730, 731 for security, the NEC, National Electrical Code. They have code making panels, and that's probably another story for another day. But we have representative on NFPA 3 and 16 that directly affect us in the security life safety world, as well as almost every one of the different committees for NFPA 72. And although it's 1 document, when you look at 101 or 72, there's a lot of different committees that make that up. Because when you look at 101, for example, it's just such a big document. It's too much work for 1 group of people to do. So what they do is they divide it up. And they divide it up into occupancy types or building and safety functions, or in the fire alarm world, they divide them up into initiating devices, notification appliances. So you can put people that have that special expertise on that 1 committee. So we've been fortunate enough to get all of these populated with people from ESA. They go to the table, they speak on behalf of ESA, they vote how ESA tells them to vote. We call that a directed vote in the industry. And then there's an opportunity in the iCode world. You know, as Shane and I have been working with Chris on populating the NFPA codes, there's also a need to populate the committees that ICC utilizes. Right now, we don't have anybody on any of these committees or these standing committees that are out there. A lot of them are available for us to have a seat at the table. At the very minimum, we can assign somebody to go as a guest. All of these things that we've talked about for the past hour or so are very open, transparent to the public. So anybody has a right to go and be a guest. And guests at many of these meetings have the ability to ask the chair, can I speak on a topic? So you can still be heard. So Shane, I don't know if you ever make a comment about this. I know you're a little bit more involved with the ICC world.
Well, one thing is, which the iCodes started last cycle, and maybe 2 cycles now it's been going on. It's the FCAC, which is the Fire Code Action Committee. And they also have the BCAC, which is the Building Code Action Committee. And the year before the proposals are due, the FCAC and the BCAC get very involved in working at a more of a committee level, similar to a technical committee for 72 or 101, in developing which proposals they wish to move forward as proposals to be then debated during their equivalent of a first draft meeting or a second draft meeting. And their involvement is much more, not quite as structured. You do have members that are named to the FCAC committee, and over time our industry have had members on the FCAC, though this cycle our industry does not have anyone on the committee. But we are able to participate. In fact, because it's now being done virtually, I think I'm on about 5 different task groups that feed into the FCAC as we develop proposals for the next edition of the I codes. And anyone can get involved with that. All you have to do is just through either me or Rodger, find out when the meetings are. It's all virtually done. They use Team as opposed to as their portal, as opposed to Zoom or some of the others. But it's very interactive. And then we do it all of this, the remainder of this year, so we get our proposals ready to submit by next year. So that's a good way to get involved.
We have a lot of different UL documents that we monitor. And when they go into any kind of changes or what have you, we kind of sift through them and we look at them, but we need people to be part of these various documents. And you see them all right here that are out there, everything from CCTV equipment to smoke detectors to nurse call equipment. And if there's a document or a standard that you think we should be involved with, but we're not, and you would like to volunteer and bring that to us, tell us and say, hey, you guys, we really need as an organization to be more involved in this, or we should be monitoring this. Let us know. We're kind of pulling all this together as best we can. But with all of this being said, whether it's an NFPA, an ICC, or a UL, we believe that we've got a handle on what's going on in our life safety world, whether it's for security or fire, or nurse call, or what have you. And if you think that there's something out there that needs to be changed or modified, shoot us an email. Tell us. Say, hey, in this document, in this chapter, it would be better if they did this, and this is why. And you don't need to worry about, well, how do I input it, or what's the next step, or I don't have it in the right form. We can do all that work. But just presenting to us your ideas, your thoughts would be a huge help. So with that, we can open it up for questions, Chris, and let people know.
Yeah, thanks, Rodger. We got a lot, but we got limited time. But one of the questions is if I'm interested in applying for a technical committee as an ESA representative, how would I go about doing that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think we'll put up an email address here that you can look at, and you can send your request there. To start out with, you don't need to worry about putting it in the right format or how do I get the information that I need for NFPA. Shoot us an email with your expression of interest and bring it in, because in some cases we have multiple people asking, and we want the best person representing us at ESA. So please don't be offended if we maybe turn you down for one committee because somebody else maybe has already asked or maybe have better qualifications. But more cases than not, we're looking for those seats. So I would just say, send an email to the address you see here, and we'll contact you, and we'll be more than happy to help you from there. When you do submit your application, you are going to need an expression of interest form and an approval letter from ESA. So Merlin's going to need to put together some type of a letter that we'll submit to say, yes, this person does have permission to be a representative for us here at ESA. And then Shane, myself, and Chris will discuss that, and we'll definitely walk you through that whole process.
Right. And another question that it has to do with NFPA 1. They've heard that NFPA 1 is going to be divided into several technical committees. Any idea of the time frame and what kind of opportunities that will provide for people interested in serving on NFPA 1?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Dr. Clary is actually a member of NFPA 1, so I'll go ahead and ask him to jump in on that one.
Thank you. And the information is correct. At the end of this cycle, the NFPA 1 Technical Committee will be disbanded with thanks and reconstituted into 4 committees. And the reason for this is NFPA 1 just got so large that for one committee to do everything, we were having very long meetings, extended meetings, and so forth. So it was felt that we need to break it up, and then we can bring in additional experts on the new technical committees. So there'll be a technical committee on fundamentals, one on building systems and occupancies, one on hazardous materials and hazardous locations, and then a correlating committee, which would just look at correlation issues from the three technical committees that will feed into the correlating committee. So the Standards Council will be putting together the first set of members to the new NFPA 1 committees at their December meeting this year. So there's still time right now to submit applications. And the NFPA, the ESA would definitely like to get members representing the ESA on at least the occupancy and building systems, and on the fundamentals technical committee, and then perhaps the correlating committee as well. Not quite certain if how much involvement we would have on hazardous materials, but we can also take a look at that as well.
Yeah, and if you're out there thinking about this to become a member, and you say, well, I've never done committee work before, I'm not sure if I'm qualified. If you've done work in that particular field and you think you're an expert in that, you're probably qualified. So go ahead and send us your expression of interest. We'll help you with all the rest of that. And please don't think that you're not worthy to do this, right? We want you involved, and we can definitely help you through this process. So just shoot us an email and let us know. And then one of the other questions that people will often ask is, okay, if I'm going to volunteer for a committee, how much time am I looking at committing to do this? It depends on the committee, but let's just say a rule of thumb might be 3 days, and let's just say on average a year. And whether that's going to be telephone calls, which is now, or face-to-face up until the past few months. So I would say in general, for each committee, figure 3 days a year to work on that.
And those are all great points. Again, if I know there's a lot of questions, please send me an email as a starting point, chris.heaton@esaweb.org, and we will definitely follow up with those questions that we have. Shane and Rodger, this was a great discussion and great overview of the codes and standards and how they interplay. And I really appreciate you guys taking the time to go through this with us and making this a really, really productive presentation.
Yeah, enjoyed it. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you to our sponsor, Altronics, and thank you to our experts today. This session was recorded, and you can find it at esaweb.org/District Week 2020 to rewatch it on demand. Thank you, everyone.